Well, thank you very much. Very interesting papers. And I've got a question for Jeremy and a question for Min-hua. The question for Jeremy has to do with the three discourses, which the global, regional, and national discourses, which you talk about in terms of China. And these do have, in the ways that you've described, some Chinese characteristics. But, as I think you might concede, this pattern really isn't unique to China at all. In fact, it's usual among large powers. I can think of, in the US, a global liberal Eikenberry-type discourse, a regional discourse, Monroe Doctrine discourse about the Western Hemisphere, and obviously in America, first Make America Great Again discourse, which is national, again, global, regional, and national. Similarly, in lots of other places, in Russia, there is a universalist Third Rome kind of discourse. There is a more regional Slavic Orthodox discourse, which affects Russian policy towards even Greece and some other countries. There is a more specific Russian that lost so much in the Soviet Union lost so much in the Second World War that somehow special considering, or in the EU, in Juncker's descriptions. There are things about liberalism, about European values, that Europe is already a region. I suppose that's not a country, so one can't quite do the same. But isn't this just very general among the countries? And for Min-hua, also about such discourses, aren't they led by elites very much? The paper is wonderful in discovering empirically, as Ed just mentioned, the factors that are relatively more important in affecting other Asian countries' perceptions of China and those that are less important. The 10, in effect, about 10% loss for China, if you will, because of force used in the South China Sea recently, and 10% gain because of perceptions about trade. But can one make some estimate of the percentage effect of popular attitudes, whatever they are, as distinct from attitudes that, maybe popular attitudes that can, over very short periods of time, be changed by elites on actual international behavior?
Let's take one or two more questions before we have the comments. Anybody else with a question?
This question is for Min-hua. I really liked the presentation. My question is about the negative trends in those particular Southeast Asian countries. As I saw your data, every single one of those countries, I thought of some incident that happened in that time frame that was very controversial involving China, whether it was Indonesia when there was near Natuna, some of the islands, you had a confrontation. Vietnam, you had Haiyang, Shiryo 981, the controversy there. So there's specific incidents that would seem to impact public opinion. I'd like to know how you account for specific instances as opposed to general impressions for driving those numbers.
Anybody else?
So, question for Min-hua and then a general question for all of you. I also was struck by the last point you made about how China should make itself more likable to citizens in neighboring countries. And of course, the Chinese government has core interests nationally, but it also has core interests as a party. And one of those core interests is to stay in power. And so democratizing within China is something the party has long considered kind of a threat to that ongoing goal. So I'm wondering what room for maneuver you think the party has in terms of doing the kinds of reforms you talked about within China without losing its grip on power. And then the more general question is, if the Chinese government under Xi Jinping decides, screw it, we're just going to go for it, we don't care what people think of us, what do you think its chances are of achieving its goals in terms of being the predominant global power? How long could that last?
Okay, why don't we go down? People can comment on the questions so far.
Let's kind of let's take the last question first in some way, because it's a kind of framing question for me in terms of the earlier question raised by a commentator in terms of empire versus sovereign equality. Actually, I think that China's aspirations and ambitions are not the same. And perhaps I might want to go by saying, you know, who really believes in equality? People believe in equality when they feel that they're slighted. That when they're in a position not to, that they feel already fine, and they tend to take a Bourdieuian position and justify why they should be better than other people. So I don't think that that's necessarily specifically Chinese. Nonetheless, I think there are some Chinese characteristics. And here's where, in terms of the question that you raised about sovereign equality, Westphalia versus empire. There's one aspect of Westphalia that the Chinese regime and the Chinese state deeply believes in. Eius regio, eius religio. That religion should belong to whoever is the state involved. That was the principle of Westphalia and the principle of sovereign equality and non-interference at the same time. This China absolutely believes it. The state should decide what ideology should prevail in its own territory, and that states are equal in that respect. Interestingly enough, that's not so different from the David Kang type of modeling of the asymmetric tributary system. Under the tributary system, China did not interfere in the internal affairs of Korea and things like that. So it's not exactly the same, because there was a huaxia, there is an ideological construct to the tributary system, which now China has emptied, and emphasizing in my paper, I talk about it quite a bit, about the He Butong, about China emphasizing diversity internationally. That's because they don't want their regime to be questioned. So it fits together very well. It fits with sovereign equality to some extent. It doesn't mean that in Chinese discourses, you get creeping in not just Yang Jiechi's statement that was an off-the-cuff verbal statement, some countries are big and some countries are small, looking at Singapore. But actually, in the white paper on Asia-Pacific security, there's a statement that says, and I quoted it, he says, essentially distinguishing between large countries and small countries shouldn't take sides. In their document, so that they're making actually now a formal difference between small countries and large countries in terms of their role in the international system. So I mean, so I think that's I don't want to say more about this, but I think that China actually doesn't aspire to world domination, and they've said so. In the same set of commentaries in August after this Ho when Xi Jinping comes back strong. There's a series of commentaries. The first one was basically that the United States is trying to encircle China, and we have to preserve our interest. The second one had to do that we don't want to tell anybody how to live their lives, and nobody should tell us how to live our lives. And that there's a deep consciousness. He believes it. He believes that the American position on universal values is fundamentally wrong, and it's unfair, and most people do not buy it. They believe, don't buy it. They'd rather not have anybody tell them what to do. So this opposition to universal values. In my paper, I talk about this a little bit, and I will elaborate it more, find more, and the discrepancy when they talk about building a community of destiny for humankind. The interesting thing, it has no values. So how do you have a community without values? It's a very peculiar construction, and it also makes it very weak. It doesn't stand up very well. So there is a difference, I think, between the United States and China at this global level, and it has effect. The Monroe Doctrine is not a contradiction of universal values. It basically says you Europeans stay out. Manifest destiny, maybe that's a little bit in contradiction. But, and the Americans tend to square it quite well. But the Chinese have a different perspective, and it's more of a Chashu Bridge. It's more Fei Xiaotong notion of a relational nexus, all centered on self, based on this kind of self-regarding. So self-regarding is not necessarily the same thing as domination. I can't go into it all today, but I don't think that China wants to dominate the world, mainly for one reason, and it was also in the same set of. China does not want to be accountable. To dominate the world needs to be accountable. One of the other commentaries said, we don't want to be the world's policeman, and opposing the concept of being the world's policeman. So there's this notion that China wants the status of leadership, but not the responsibilities of leadership. And in that it's quite, in some ways, different from the United States. American citizens may not want the responsibilities of leadership, but it's sort of embedded in the concept of being the dominant liberal state, and it becomes difficult to. We can have this discussion can go on for a long time.
All right, I think I answered a much easier question Tim mentioned. From model perspective, we cannot tell the differences because the only thing we now know is the treatment variable, which is the 2013 before and after. So what you mentioned, what if there are multiple in different countries all affect, causing the decreasing numbers of approval rate for China's influences? What about in Taiwan is one event, in Indonesia is the other event, but somehow they all in those windows. I mean, we lack of data, we cannot tell. But if the incidents that you refer, all related, comes back to the behavioral that China doing back then in December 2013, then we still can attribute to the South China Sea. So that, but seriously, we don't, unless we have specific question regarding people's response to the specific incidents that you are referring. Okay, then his top question. I think both White and the lady's question is really tough. And I have some thought I wanted to share. The first thing is that the message the paper want to convey is that China always war on Taiwan. It doesn't matter what you say, it only matters what you did. I will give the same comment back to China decision maker. It doesn't matter what you say, no matter how benevolent, no matter how you are peaceful, you want to contribute to the world. It only matters what you did, for better or for worse. The better part is, undeniably, China really played the model head for the economic globalization for the past 2 decades. They contribute a lot. Of course, people will say stealing or doing a lot, but China also took a lot. like environmental pollution, cheap labors, all those things. For all iPhone, I got iPhone here. China only got maybe 10% of the profit for overall profit. So it's exploration for China's perspective producing this, although China earn money as well, but only 10% of the every revenue from this iPhone. So what I'm saying is, China's effort try to integrate into the world through economic globalization has already, they put a lot of substantial efforts on there. And people knows it. And people try to give the credit, and it's a long-term effort. It's not just one time, oh, we want to contribute to the world. So this kind of behavior that wins hearts and minds in an Asian neighboring country, because Asian people knows we need China to keep our economic growth continuing. So this kind of thing is best public diplomacy. It's through daily effort, long term. It's not just one time propaganda. In fact, if you propaganda more, then it might work in another way. So what I'm saying, this is we should give credit to China. But on the other hand, China's the image could be ruined just by, for example, very quick actions like in South China Sea. And it would be even worse when China make this kind of, outrageous rude languages in international community. So that's really bad part. And so it comes to the questions that this paper often being criticized, or this kind of research always being criticized, that foreign policy is an elite level. It's a decision makers level scan instead of people's scan. And you're doing the public opinion research. No, it doesn't matter. But I just want to give you some example, like Malaysia. No one expect Mahathir, the alliance as a whole, who took power, and that's May. But actually, Najib really stayed very close, and even took a lot of personal bribe, and they signed a lot of deals to China. And then Mahathir, in a way, in their campaign, trying to make out this. So one thing is that public opinion matters in some occasions. That when the political leader in opposition in other countries, they try to use of this, like the DPP in Taiwan in 2014, the service trade and other trade pact, that use the sentiment that people afraid of China, over-dependence on China, and they might inflict like security hazards. This kind of sentiments to win the elections. So what I'm saying that these factors may play big at the right moment when window of opportunity comes. The political leader in some countries, when they sense this public opinion orientation, they will definitely play this card and win the election. So China got to understand, for example, like Myanmar, people really, if you do popular opinion poll in Myanmar, people really mad about Chinese. It doesn't matter military government, Aung San Suu Kyi, they stay with China. They will try to build good relationship with China. But deep down in society level, people hate China a lot. In Mongolia as well. So there are countries you can sense that kind of vibe. When there are opposition faction in this country, either it's in autocracy or in a limited democracy, their political campaign opponent will always exploit these kind of factors and make out of it when time is ripe. So China do need to care this. And then the last question is about ruin. How much ruin China can maneuver. This is something this paper not really addressed, but it's really important. We still don't know how much constraint that China tied their hand. They had to act like this. I can think a lot of cases China can actually cut down, not necessarily rhetoric or something. That's definitely doable. But when it comes down to the core national interests, maybe China still need to occupy the land, maybe need to dispel other countries' vessel, something like that. But do they need to military build up that quick to make it literally like military base on those Swahili Island? I don't know. Does it matter that China build it slowly? China is afraid if they are not expedite the process, then they will never do it. So that's why China in a hurry to get it done and hope that people can absorb it and used to it, and then that bad feeling goes away. But I think China didn't expect that Trump really react that quick to make it out all escalate into all publicly saying that we want to deal with not just militarily, we focus on economy. What Trump actually do, trying to put pressures on China, because China, the soft spot actually internally in terms of power-wise, is their economy. China have a very serious problem internally in terms of economic structures, like that, like a bubble of the property, the real estate, local debt, these kind of things. So in a way, Trump is smart, trying to give a lot of pressure. And China, not only to deal with all those security or threat perception, need to really handle with their internal economic problem. But China right now tie their hand. They need to engage all the trade war, all those economic issues. U.S. try to pressurize the Chinas. So I don't know. In my sense that there are a lot of unnecessary rules. China can, if they discreet enough, they can cut down. But when it comes down to core interests, I agree with you. Maybe China do not have that much room because when it's down to what you actually did, then China. I still think that China's. Again, I want to give you one last example. China do have interests like anti-terrorism, because what I know is that there are some Xinjiang Uyghur, they're actually going down to Malaysia, Indonesia, and go to Syria and join the ISIS. When they're back, they're always through the other routes, through Central Asia and other places as well. So in a way, the terrorist the situation is really bad in Xinjiang. So in some way, I sympathize China when they deal with the Xinjiang problem. But the way they deal with, I mean, they do have common interest with the U.S. trying to share information or doing a lot of things to prevent terrorism. But if they're doing this, if China doing this, it will compromise. I mean, they have their national security system. There are a lot of information they didn't want to share with the U.S. So this top level, I mean, even if they have common interest in fighting terrorism, but in a way, China tried to treat it as a domestic problem, and they wanted to contain it, dealing in their own way. So that's what we now look at. I mean, so I don't know if China change their mindset and be confident and can, I mean, at least case by case or minimally share with and join with the U.S. to fight with terrorism. I don't know what is the likelihood doing this, but I still think that there's a room, at least at some level, that China can become more open, at least more open in different policy areas. So, but again, I don't know internally how tight China's hand is really tight in their policymakers' perspective. Thank you.
Well, Professor Hung, you want a final word? Okay.
I want to have two little short ones. In terms of whether leaders can be prisoners of their own rhetoric, one sentence: build a wall. And on the question of room for maneuver, I think to just summarize, the reason why Canadians may still have more confidence in the United States, despite what Mr. Trump does to us, and why China has some problems right now, is because people perceive American society and the policy process to be permeable. And the more impermeable Xi Jinping makes the Chinese policy process and the Chinese society, the less trust it evokes in China's neighbors and friends. And that's a problem they have to deal with.
I have a quick comment.
Quick comment.
And it's very interesting that the Chinese leader might be tied, have their hand tied a lot, but definitely right now, the Chinese leader, if I am Xi Jinping, I might be looking at Putin. That whether you need to care about the public opinion of your neighbor, whether you need to tone down to make good neighbor and things like that. You look at the example of Putin. Actually, you don't need to care about this. That you just do whatever you want to expand your territory, get Crimea, half of Ukraine, and what do they do about it? And Russia's economy has been collapsing for quite a while, and Putin survived. And if I'm Xi Jinping or any Xi Jinping that look for survival, I think Putin is a good model. And if they see Putin as a successful model to learn from, that I'm pessimistic that China will have a second thought about like making good neighbor and tone down and things like that. So in a kind of a world of bully, that is the bully that stay on course, that can finally win, at least for now, I guess.
Well, as a final word before we thank our speakers, it's obvious you should not come here if you're looking for happiness. Well, let's thank all our speakers.
role in the exploration.